Hey, welcome to another video. My name is Abhishek. I also go by Teacher Tuber, and today's video is about William Shakespeare, who's considered one of the most prominent playwrights in the English language. Growing up, even in school, growing up in the Middle East, we had to read and learn about Shakespeare. And there are lots of mixed thoughts about the relevance of his work in modern times, but he has survived time. And before I start this presentation, I'd love to maybe talk about my personal relationship with this author. For instance, in school, I didn't particularly enjoy the stories. I remember reading Caesar, and I thought the language that he used was very distant and inaccessible. So even at university, I studied literature and I was not able to really connect with many of his plays and sonnets. But something changed when I got to see an adaptation of one of his plays at the Performing Center here in Mumbai. And that was the shift for me in my relationship with this author, because that's when I realized that he was really talking about themes and ideas that are relevant to any person in any country in any cultural context. And these are themes like power, love, death, dreams, hopes, fears, ambition, jealousy, hatred, guilt. So a lot of the characters in his plays and in his sonnets go through many of these emotions and states of being human. So let's learn a little bit about Shakespeare today. Who's William Shakespeare? So he was born in 1564 and he passed away in 1616. He was an English poet, playwright, and actor. He wrote 37 plays and 150 short and long poems, primarily in a 14 to 15-year period, actually a 20-year period between 1589 to 1613. His work is classified into comedies, histories, tragedies, romances, and poems. Now, let's understand a little bit about life in Shakespeare's London. So, at that time, the English monarchy was in power, and Queen Elizabeth I was in power from 1558 to 1603, when Shakespeare was just starting, and then King James I was in power from 1603 to 1625. So, it was a relatively stable period in England at that point of time. There was a great increase in foreign trade and a flourishing literary culture. Shakespeare was the principal dramatist of the acting company Lord Chamberlain's Men, that was later known as King's Men. And the reason it was called King's Men was because it was patronized by King James I, who would provide the funds to run and produce these plays. Now, Shakespeare's body of work. So, his complete works was published in 1623, 7 years after his death. And at that time, I was actually reading this book by Bill Bryson where he spoke about how printing texts was not very common at that time. So, it was very rare for someone to actually print and publish a text. So, there were two printers who actually took up the mantle to print Shakespeare's plays. And I'm actually reading from this passage, page 154 of this wonderful book by Bill Bryson. So, Shakespeare's plays might have been lost too had it not been for the heroic efforts of his close friends and colleagues, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, who 7 years after his death produced a folio edition of his complete works. And Hemmings and Condell were the last of the original Chamberlain's men. As with nearly everyone else in this story, we know only a little about them. Hemmings was the company's business manager, but also sometimes an actor, and at least according to tradition, is said to have been the first Falstaff. Condell was an actor, esteemed evidently for comedic roles. They were influenced by another writer of the time, Ben Jonson, who released his first folio in 1616. And the book that was published in 1623 was called Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. And it was priced at £1, which was pretty expensive for that time. So these original first folios are today some of the most treasured parts of library collections. Over his lifetime, he published 37 plays that included 12 tragedies, 14 comedies, and 11 history plays. He also wrote 4 poems and 150 sonnets. Now, what's a tragedy play? It's basically a play or a theatrical performance that treats in a serious and dignified style the terrible events encountered or caused by an individual. A comedy play is a type of drama, the chief object of which, according to modern notions, is to amuse. A history play is based on a historical narrative. So, a lot of Shakespeare's plays were based on leaders of that time and of times before. A sonnet is a fixed verse form of Italian origin consisting of 14 lines that are typically 5 foot iambics, rhyming according to a prescribed scheme. So the iambic pentameter was the structure that he normally followed for his sonnets, and it's basically about the sound of the words within a verse. For instance, da dum, da dum, da dum, da dum. So da is like a higher pitch, dum is like a lower pitch. Then you again have da as a higher pitch, dum is a lower pitch. So that was like the tonal structure of the verses in that sonnet. And the themes of Shakespeare's sonnets include the shortness of life, the fleetingness of beauty, desire and longing, and love as a sickness. Again, these are themes you'd see in artistic productions from almost any culture, so it's not limited to Shakespeare as such. This was a picture from a library where they have an original copy of Shakespeare's fourth folio, which was published in 1685, almost 50 to 60 years after his death. Now, Shakespeare as a person, he is most likely to have received a classical Latin education in Stratford, which is a place in the UK. He married Anne Hathaway when he was only 18, and he had three children, Susanna, Hamnet, and Judith. The first part about him being educated in Latin education was very important because English was not the up and coming language at that point, and Latin was the language of the upper classes. So it was the language preferred in many social circles. Also, his family, you don't know a lot about them, but he did lose some of his children to illness, and because there weren't as many public records of people's lives, we don't know too much about his personal life. For instance, from 1585 to 1592, we almost know nothing about where Shakespeare was. And there are myths about him being a schoolmaster, a soldier, but we can't confirm it. And that's what this book also says, is that there are several claims, but we don't really know what happened. Now, Shakespeare acted in many of his plays. Some of his plays were not original, and that's something to consider. They were based on old stories, like Hamlet was based on a well known Scandinavian legend called Hamlet. And because there wasn't as wide an access to books and publications, I think you had to be within a certain social class to access print copies or performances of these stories from other cultures. Shakespeare was also a very shrewd business mind and he co produced many of his plays. Now, in terms of the performance space, in 1599, Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, took up residence in the newly built Globe. Julius Caesar was one of the first plays performed there, and performances at the Globe were divided into 3 seasons with breaks around Christmas when the players performed at court because they were funded by the court, so they had to perform for the rulers at that point, which were the English monarchs. Now, this is what the theatre looks like in a modern sort of version, but it must have been very different at that time. This is sort of a modern recreation of Shakespeare's work. In 1608, they had a smaller venue called the Blackfriars, and it was the first indoor theatre in the world. And The Tempest was shot there, that has a lot of weather references like good weather, bad weather, storms, and more. So these are some facts about this other theatre because the performance space often defined what kind of plays you would write and produce. So an open theatre and a closed theatre would demand very different sort of audiences, and I think the seats at Blackfriars was also much more expensive than the others. This is what it looked like on the inside. Now here are some statistics about Shakespeare's work. So the total words in all his plays were 830,000. That's a lot of words, and these are published words. 37 plays, the average per play is about 22,000. Like Hamlet had 30,000 words, which is one of his longer plays. Romeo and Juliet, which has been adapted in a lot of different cultures, had around 25,000 words, and Julius Caesar had about 20,000 words. Now, I find graphs, quite fascinating. So, his tragedies and comedies had the most words, while the poems and sonnets had the least, because in the verse form, you try to communicate more with fewer words and in a more creative manner. But in tragedies, you have more of a space to write in prose. So that allows you to extend your word count, which shouldn't be the objective, but just seeing these numbers helps you understand the length of some of his works. Now, over here, you can see the number of characters in all his plays. I just thought this graph was interesting. So, in the 12th night, there's less than like 5 to 10 characters, whereas in a play like Henry VI, there's over 60 characters, and in some of his more popular plays like Romeo and Juliet, there's around 30 to 32 characters. So whenever you do introduce a character in a play, you have to describe them. They have to have a specific purpose. So there's a lot of work to introduce and build a character's arc in any story, whether they are the main character or a supporting character. Now, Shakespeare's use of language. I thought I'd share a little video about his like a modern performance of a scene from the Hamlet, and it's by the actor Andrew Scott. So hopefully we can watch it. And the reason I wanted to show you this is to get an understanding of how a lot of Shakespeare's work was written for performance. So the people were actually experiencing the sound and the bodies of the actor, bringing these characters to life. And I think growing up in university and school, I always read Shakespeare rather than watched it being performed, which is why I felt that disconnect. And very often when I would read it in the same tone, which was not how it was meant to be consumed or engaged with. So let's watch this and understand the difference between a performance and just reading a text.
Or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing, end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by asleep, to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time?
Okay, so thanks to BBC for that short clip of the Andrew Scott performance. Again, I think what you can see there is how the mood of that space, the clothes that the actor was wearing, the way he was moving his hands, the way he was moving his eyes, the way he was talking about that, what that character was feeling, is such an important part of the performance. And you can miss out on some of these things, especially because Shakespeare's English was not the modern form of English that we know. It's a much older version of the language that was popular at that time. So you have to not get overwhelmed by the language and really focus on what the character is going through. That was my entry point into Shakespeare. What are the emotional dilemmas that the character is experiencing, and why is that relevant to your life? And maybe not relevant. And you can also critique, his work in whatever way possible, which I think is important to do for any author. So, Shakespeare's use of language. Now, a syllable is a unit of pronunciation. For instance, ap ill has two syllables because ap is one, pill is the other. So it's a unit of pronunciation having one vowel sound with or without surrounding consonants. So A, E, I, O, U are considered vowels, and the other letters in the alphabet are considered consonants. So they're combined in different ways to create words, and these words are used differently in prose and verse. Now, rhyme is a correspondence of sound between words or the endings of words. So, dog, fog. So these they sound similar, they're often used at the end, but you can also have internal rhyme schemes in the middle or start of a sentence. Poetic meter is the unit of rhythm in poetry comprised of two or more stressed or unstressed syllables. So da dum, da dum, da dum, da dum, da dum. So this is an example of pentameter where you have five repetitions of da dum, high low, high low, high low. So the reason it's called pentameter because penta represents five and you have five of this, so that's what pentameter means. So this is a rhyme scheme in which each line consists of 10 syllables. The syllables are divided into five pairs called iambs, and the iamb structure is made up of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So da dum, da dum, da dum, da dum. So here's an example from his sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So you're supposed to go on a higher note when you say the da part, or bada, 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 bada. And that's how these actors would actually enunciate these words that were in his plays. And this is how you read it. So there's less emphasis and there's more emphasis. Now, Shakespeare and film, there are modern films from different Hollywood, and British cinema, Indian cinema. You have adaptations of his work. And that's why I think as a writer, he's very relevant to modern times because the way he spoke about, some of these themes I think are relevant in today's day and age as well. And I think good artists should do that. They should talk about things that are relevant across time and across cultures. So here's a Japanese and an Indian adaptation of King Lear and Othello. These are the posters again of these films. Here's an Indian adaptation of Romeo and Juliet that came out in 2013. And I was going to show you the trailer, but you can actually just look up the trailer of this particular film, Ram Leela. Now, Shakespeare in translation, let's learn a little bit about that. So here's Ian McKellen actually saying these plays weren't written to be read, they were written to be spoken out loud and acted. And I remember experiencing this as a teacher when I was in teachers' college. I'd actually gone to a place in Canada called Stratford where they spoke about how they made us actually read the plays. And I think that was really interesting because when you read the plays aloud yourself, you actually realize why you can't be speaking in a low tone when a character is angry, right? So I think as teachers, we really have to realize that you have to imbibe the worlds of these characters when you are reading them out to kids. And I think YouTube's a great way to watch a lot of these productions. You have performances. So here's a speech by Ian McKellen. Okay, so here's a random fact, the causes of death in Shakespeare's plays. So as you can see in this pie chart, most of them were stabbed, but there were also very random things like being pursued by a bear or grief or baked into a pie. So there's a lot of diversity there. And then, is it a good idea to read Shakespeare? It doesn't matter. If you don't read him, it's not something that will change your life significantly because you can read other authors and they will teach you something about the world. So all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So if you read Shakespeare, if you don't read Shakespeare, it's okay as long as you develop a love for literature, which I think is the larger goal of reading any good story. So on that note, we come to the end of this presentation by TeacherTuber. These were 10 reasons you need to read Shakespeare. Yeah, and I will include links to some of the resources I spoke about in this video in the show notes, and also to performances that are available after permission online and other ways to access this author's work. Thank you again for tuning in, and I hope to do more such presentations. I really enjoy teaching, and that's one of the reasons I created this YouTube channel. So I'd love your feedback in the comments, and if you do decide to go watch a performance in your country, you can find local performances or watch them online. I'd love for you to maybe reach out, on YouTube and Let me know what you thought about that work and recommend other plays because I haven't read all his plays. And until next time, keep learning.